Chapter 1311. She was clearly the party involved, but she was able to make herself sound like an outsider, calmly, making it impossible for others to doubt her. Maisy took a glance at the rearview mirror and frowned slightly. Isn't the car behind the one parked outside the police station? The other party suddenly accelerated, overtook her car, and was now driving right in front of her car. At that moment, Maisy's front wheels broke abruptly, and the front of the car got out of control. When it was about to hit, Maisy had to turn the steering wheel quickly, and the body of the car skidded into a sign by the roadside. The sudden impact left a high-pitched hum echoing within her head, and her vision turned blurry as she stared at the vehicle that stopped right next to her car for a few minutes and then drove away. Meanwhile, at Black Gold, Nolan and Quincy came out of the conference room. After Quincy answered a phone call, he caught up to Nolan immediately. Mr. Goldmann, Mrs. Goldmann has run into an accident. Nolan's expression changed. He instantly tore off his tie and went with Quincy with a grim face. Cecile, who was walking behind them, had just received a call too. The moment she saw the metal doors closed, the corners of her lips could not help but rise. You're planning to run a background check on me? I won't allow it to end so soon. In the nursing room of the hospital, a nurse bandaged a small gauze on Maisy, instructed her not to drench her wound, and then went out. Maisy rubbed the gauze. The wound was on the brow bone, so it hurt a lot when she frowned. At that moment, Nolan appeared at the door of the ward. Maisy was astonished, and looking at Nolan's dimmed face, she immediately knew that he was furious. She stood up and walked toward him. I was careless this time around. I'll be more careful next time. Nolan creased his brows. You want this incident to happen again? It won't happen again, I promise. Maisy took his hand and stared at him with a sincere expression. Nolan lifted his hand and gently caressed the wound on her brow bone. He was afraid she would feel pain, so he did not dare to rub it. He then took a deep breath and retracted his hand. Where said I? I thought I was only heading to the police station, so I didn't ask her to accompany me. I didn't expect someone to have the guts to rig my car when it was parked outside the police station. Maisy smiled, raised her hand to rub her forehead, and thought of something. I wrote down the other party's license plate number and asked the police to trace the car for me. Nolan hugged her and said in a deep voice, remember, no more acting by yourself in the future. Maisy pressed her cheek against his warm chest and smiled. Okay. At the Goldmann mansion, Nolan carried Maisy into the mansion, and Alfred, the butler, was stunned when he saw the injury on Maisy's forehead. What's the matter? Madam? Something happened, so we're moving back here for the time being. After a brief reply, Nolan passed by Alfred and carried her upstairs. He then put her on the bed when they came into the room. The moment Maisy touched the mattress, she pulled the blanket to cover herself and asked in a low voice, Is this really necessary? Nolan responded with a light hum, sat on the bed, and looked at her. Otherwise, my heart won't be able to handle it. My heart was about to stop the moment I heard about Maisy's accident. I'd rather die if I have to experience that a few more times. Maisy chuckled. At that moment, Quincy called. Nolan did not avoid her either, by answering the call right in front of her. Have you found something? Quincy replied, I've managed to find that person, but... Hearing him pause, Nolan frowned. But what? Quincy sounded suspicious. The other party said that Tanner Hannigan of the Hannigan Incorporated is the person who ordered him to do so. Tanner Hannigan? Maisy was astounded when she heard what Quincy said. How could it be Tanner? Quincy played the recording of the man's confession. Mr. Hannigan from Hannigan Incorporated is the one who ordered me to do so, so go to him. I just did what I was paid to do. Chapter 1312. Nolan's eyes became stern and cold. He hung up the call and turned to look at her. Be good and wait for me here. He then got up and went out. Maisy leaned her back against the head of the bed, and she fell into a daze when the door closed. Tanner wouldn't make a move on me for no reason. This matter is getting stranger and stranger. What's the reason behind all this? Nolan and Quincy brought some men to Hannigan Incorporated directly. Their stance and grandeur seemed to have petrified the staff members at the front desk. They then called Tanner's assistant immediately after returning to their senses. The assistant was a little confused when he received the news. He was about to report the incident to Tanner, but the moment the metal doors of the elevator opened, Nolan had already walked out of it. He glanced at the assistant expressionlessly. "Is Mr. Hannigan in?" The assistant nodded. "Yes." He slowly undid the buttons on his sleeves and followed Quincy straight to the entrance of Tanner's office. Quincy then knocked on the door and pushed it in. Tanner lifted his head and seemed a little surprised. He put the documents down. "Is there something wrong, Mr. Goldmann?" Nolan walked to the couch, sat down on his own, and crossed his legs. "I've come here to ask you something." Tanner got up, walked around the end of his desk, and sat across from Nolan. "What's the matter?" Nolan looked at Quincy, and the latter stepped forward and handed a voice recorder to Tanner. Upon receiving it, Tanner glanced at the gadget and turned on the recording. After listening to the recording, Tanner was momentarily dumbfounded, and his eyebrows could not help but crease. He only lifted his head after a long time. "I don't know anything about this." Tanner seemed to remember something and added, "However, a woman did come to me yesterday." Quincy was astonished. "What kind of woman are you talking about?" "I don't know. She had photos of Pearl being abroad. She told me Pearl will only return to me when Maisy dies." Tanner replied calmly. Quincy looked at Nolan in surprise as Nolan frowned. "Do you believe her?" Tanner exchanged glances with him. "The person that I believe is Pearl. She didn't leave me because of Maisy. I know this better than anyone else. Regardless of whether Maisy died or not, Pearl would never return to me. I'm not dumb. The woman came to me with Pearl's photo for a reason, so how could I take action so rashly without knowing her purpose and identity? But I didn't expect that even though I didn't do anything, the blame would still be placed on me." Quincy placed Cecile's information on the table. "Is the woman her?" Tanner was slightly startled and frowned. "That's her." Nolan stood up at this time, and he suddenly stopped before he was about to leave the office. "Tanner, I think you should acknowledge a fact first." Seeing that Tanner was puzzled, Nolan turned to look at him. "Since this woman knows what happened between Pearl and Maisy in the past, it means that she's done her homework. And if she can show you pictures of Pearl, perhaps." Tanner's expression changed slightly, and he stood up abruptly. "Are you saying that Pearl isn't safe?" Nolan had something to say, but chose to keep it to himself. "Although it's just a hypothesis, you shouldn't rule out the possibility of this outcome. You should know what to do." When Nolan left the office, Quincy followed him and whispered while they were on their way out, "Damn it. How could that woman know so much? Even if it's to avenge her younger sister, she must have found the wrong person. Even if Cecile is truly Maxine Reynolds, Maxine has been living in Staso all this while. How could she know about the incident that started the grudge between Pearl and Mrs. Goldmann that took place a few years ago? She even managed to locate Linda. This woman is terrifying." Chapter 1313. Even if she's investigated Mrs. Goldmann before this, it's impossible for her to know everything down to the very details as if she's very close to Mrs. Goldmann. Besides, if Maxine wants to avenge Sue Reynolds, the person that she should hate should be Rowena, because Rowena was the one who killed Sue. So, why would she make Mrs. Goldmann her primary target instead? Nolan stopped in front of the elevator, fastened his buttons while listening to Quincy's mumbling, and turned to look at him. This isn't an act of revenge. The elevator's doors opened at this moment. Quincy followed Nolan in and pressed the floor button. He could not help but wonder. What is it if it's not for revenge? She's doing so just for fun? Nolan laughed. If what you want is revenge, will you end the other party directly? Quincy paused for a bit. That's for sure. However, what I do must be permitted by law. That's it. Nolan's expression looked meaningful and profound. If all she wanted were to take revenge, she would have killed Z directly, but all she's done so far is either hire someone else to harm Z or lay her fingers on the people around Z. Thus, rather than looking at this and saying that it's an act of revenge, it looks more like she's playing with her prey. It's just like when a cat is hunting its prey. It usually doesn't swallow it in one bite. It will wait for its prey to slowly lose its ability to fight back while playing with it. That's when the cat will treat its prey as food. Quincy was stunned, thinking that it was indeed very suspicious. If her target had always been Mrs. Goldmann, she would have a better chance at it if she joined Soul rather than Black Gold, but she chose to join Black Gold instead. If Linda was killed because she wanted to cover up her identity, why would she take advantage of Mr. Hannigan's feelings for Pearl? And if she wanted to kill Mrs. Goldmann, she wouldn't have only punctured her tire. If it's said that people who want revenge are extremely scary, then what level is Cecile at? Back in the car, Nolan instructed Quincy, get someone to look into the relationship between Sue and Maxine when they were both living in Staso and Maxine's traces over the years. Also, get someone to ask Mr. Kestner about her. He should know her the best. At the Goldmann mansion, Maisy walked into the study and saw Alfred sorting out the books on the bookshelf. Thus, she asked, "Why are you suddenly sorting out the books?" Alfred glanced back at her and responded with a smile. Mr. Goldmann Sr. said that there are too many items on display on the bookshelf, so it's time to sort it out. Many of the books displayed here are books from the past, and we don't even have enough boxes to store them now. After all, bookshelves have to be freed up from time to make space for some new books. Maybe the young lady and young masters will need some space on the shelf in the future. Maisy's gaze stopped on the back of a photo frame placed on the top of one of the boxes. She picked up the photo frame and turned it over. It was a photo from the old days. In the group photo, the young man sitting in the middle had the facial features of a mixed-race man, and she recognized him almost instantly. Is this grandfather when he was young? Alfred glanced at the photo frame in her hand, stopped what he was doing, and answered, yes, it's a photo of Elder Master Goldmann and the Summers. Maisy was startled. The Summers? As in Rowena's grandparents? Alfred nodded. He claimed that besides Rowena's grandparents, the other boy standing right beside Titus was Rowena's father, Tyson Summers, and the young girl in the upper left corner, who was standing next to the matriarch of the Summers back then, was Tyson's fiancée, Lorraine Wolfsbane. Maisy looked at everyone in the old photo. Although the photo was yellowish and blurry, the facial features of the people could still be seen, and Lorraine looked somewhat similar to Rowena. Maisy smiled. Mr. Summers and Mrs. Summers had been arranged to marry each other since they were babies, so their relationship must be close, right? If I was not mistaken, Rowena's full name is Rowena Wolfsbane Summers. Her parents named her after both their last names, so it seems that the relationship between her parents was rather good. Unexpectedly, Alfred sighed at that moment. Their relationship might seem close, but in reality, Mr. Summers didn't like his fiancée at all. Chapter 1314. Maisy was stunned. He didn't like her? Alfred sighed. Lorraine came from the maternal side of the family and is considered a distant relative. Although it was already in the post-reform era, the Wolfsbanes was a huge and wealthy family at that time and retained some feudal ideology. Mr. Summers was a boy, so he had a better education, but Lorraine's story was different. She didn't have the opportunity to attend school at that time, so her education level was different from that of Mr. Summers, and it was difficult to get along with someone whose ideas and concepts were so distinct from hers. What's more, Lorraine was Mr. Summers's cousin, so in other words, he was forced to marry his own cousin. Even though they weren't closely related, still, not many people could accept it back then. Maisy was a little surprised to hear that. Marriages between close relatives were basically an ancient tradition. It was very common before the late 19th century, especially amongst large and prestigious families in which they wanted to preserve the family's wealth, maintain geographic proximity, and keep traditions. It was just like the royal families of some countries nowadays. They were still keen on marriages between close relatives, which was not acceptable to everyone. Maisy did not expect that Rowena's parents would get connected through such a tie. She placed the photo frame back and thought of something. Grandfather claimed that he brought Rowena in and raised her because of the death of her parents. Is that true? That's right. Alfred nodded and explained slowly. It was only after Lorraine's death that Elder Master Goldmann brought Rowena with him. He also promised the Summers he would take good care of Rowena. Elder Master Goldmann wouldn't be that disappointed if Rowena hadn't done something like that back then. Maisy asked out of the blue, what about her father? Alfred was about to answer the question, but Nolan appeared at the door at that moment. If you want to know about these, why didn't you ask me? Maisy was startled at first, but then walked up to him with a smile. That was fast. He raised his eyebrows slightly. Was it fast? Seeing that he meant something again, Maisy kicked him. Nolan ducked and laughed. How could you beat your husband in front of Alfred? Maisy choked on her own words. I didn't hit you. You should carry on with the task on hand. Maisy turned around, looked at Alfred, who was smiling, and said so as she pushed Nolan out of the study. In the corridor, Nolan was pushed by her to the door of their bedroom. He turned around abruptly, and Maisy was caught off guard and fell into his arms. Nolan caught her and pinched her chin. Wow, you can't wait any longer, huh? Yes, I can't wait any longer. Now let me in. She laughed angrily and pushed Nolan into the room. Nolan leaned against the wall, wrapped his arm around her soft, slender waist, and asked with a hint of amusement flashing across his eyes, what do you want to know? She snorted. You stood at the door and eavesdropped the whole time, didn't you? Then answer the question that I asked Alfred just now. Nolan picked her up abruptly, and Maisy subconsciously wrapped her arms around his neck. You haven't answered me yet. Aren't you tired of talking while standing? He sat on the edge of the bed, still holding her in his arms, and answered her seriously. The Summers gave Rowena to my grandfather right after Aunt Summers passed away. Uncle Summers was already out of the equation at that time. She was slightly stunned. Nolan continued calmly. Uncle Summers was found dead in a foreign country a few years later. I heard that he got stabbed several times by a robber and died. Maisy lowered her gaze, and her eyelashes trembled. So that's her story. Nolan caressed her cheek with his palm. In addition to helping the Summers take care of Rowena because of the kindness he received from them back when he was a kid, my grandfather sympathized with her backstory. She spent more time with her mother since she was a child, but her mother did not treat her well because she was a girl, and she didn't get to see her father very often. So, perhaps Rowena's existence reminded my grandfather of the fact that he himself couldn't be by my father's side when he was a kid. As for my father, he may not be where he is today if it weren't for the Summer who took him in as if he was their biological grandson. Chapter 1315. Titus had chosen to believe in Rowena over and over again back then only because he wanted to give Rowena the opportunity to change for the better. In fact, it was not that Titus did not doubt Rowena, it was just that his prejudice against Maisy and his stubbornness made him turn a blind eye to the facts. No one would deny that Titus had always been kind and benevolent to Rowena, but what he did not know was that his kindness was also the force that drove Rowena toward the sins that she committed. Maisy leaned on his shoulder. If she had a complete and happy family, perhaps she wouldn't have grown into someone that extreme. So, you're a strong woman. Nolan interrupted her with a smile and held her cheek in his hand. At least you've grown into a kind and considerate woman. She taught. At least my mother loved me very much. Although her father and mother had not gotten together because of love, her mother's love for her was sincere and genuine. She thought of something and looked up at him. By the way, you didn't go to confront Tanner, did you? Nolan responded with a faint hum. This matter has nothing to do with Tanner, but Cecile has approached him because she wants to use him to harm you. Maisy pursed her lips. It's because of Pearl. The only thing that can be used to manipulate Tanner should be related to Pearl. He laughed. You're quite smart. That's why I asked Tanner to stay put for now when it comes to this matter. I've always been Cecile's target. Maisy stared straight at Nolan, but she hasn't come at me directly, not even once. It seems that she's been playing a game of cat and mouse with me. Nolan laughed out loud. Are you planning to fight back? Otherwise, everything that's happened so far makes me seem so passive. Maisy flattened the collar of his shirt and approached him. Don't all good hunters usually appear as the prey at first? Nolan supported her neck gently with his palms, bowed his head, and kissed her on her forehead. The premise is that you're not allowed to get hurt again. She buried herself into his shoulder and exclaimed, this was really an accident. Nolan stroked the top of her head with a smile. That's why you should be even more vigilant starting now. And what do you plan to do next? Maisy raised her head. Then he needs your help, Knowles. 2 days later, gossip about Tanner of Hannigan Incorporated taking revenge on Maisy was spreading like wildfire within Black Gold. I heard that Mr. Hannigan made a move on Mrs. Goldmann because of what happened to Miss Santiago back then. That's so terrifying. But didn't Miss Santiago and Mr. Hannigan terminate their engagement long ago? Why would Mr. Hannigan retaliate against Mrs. Goldmann for Miss Santiago now? That's so strange. Who knows? Mrs. Goldmann seems to have suffered a lot of grievances. The two seemed to have quarreled when she came to see Mr. Goldmann this morning. To be honest, this is my first time seeing Mr. and Mrs. Goldmann make such a big fuss. The discussion between the two female staff members in the pantry just happened to be overheard by Cecile, who was passing by. Cecile stood at the door and peeped in through the gap in the door, and the corners of her lips twitched coldly. Nolan quarreled with Maisy? This was really out of my expectations. Aren't the two of them Basberg's model couple? It's so easy to create conflict between the two of them. Heh, sure enough, all men change after marriage. Maisy, oh Maisy, you're really a pitiful woman. And Rowena, allow me to help you out. I'll make sure you get to see how the man you loved so much falls into the abyss just like how your father did. At the administrative office. Nolan kicked Quincy out of the office. All the staff of the administration department witnessed the misery that Quincy was in and did not dare to breathe. Chapter 1316. Quincy had a sad expression. He was actually very impressed with Nolan's acting, but that was too much. How could he kick him out? Cecile suddenly showed up next to Quincy, Mr. Lawson. Quincy turned to look at her. He was surprised, but then smiled. Miss Wolfsbane, Mr. Goldmann is in a bad mood. I'm afraid that he won't be able to focus on work. The woman must have heard the rumors in the company, so shouldn't she take the chance to annoy Maisy? The Goldmann couple had put on a performance because they wanted to give Cecile another chance. If she thought that Nolan wouldn't stand on Maisy's side, then she would have her chance. Why was she there? Did she have another plan? Oh? She pretended to be troubled. But there's something that I need to talk to Mr. Goldmann about. Could you help me, please? Quincy scratched his chin. I'll have to ask him, but I can't promise anything. She smiled. Sure. Quincy knocked on the door when Nolan's cold voice could be heard. Didn't I ask you to get lost? Quincy lowered his head. Mr. Goldmann, Miss Wolfsbane says she has something to speak to you about. Could you? It was quiet for a moment. Let her in. Cecile didn't expect Nolan to want to see her, so she was secretly proud but quietly snapped back. After getting his approval, she walked into the room, and the moment Quincy closed the door, he went to the stairwell and called Maisy. Maisy took the call and found out that Cecile had gone to see Nolan. She wasn't upset but instead smiled. Let Nolan find out what her motives are then. Quincy was surprised. Ma'am, aren't you worried that the woman has bad intentions? Maisy stood in front of the windows and looked at the building in front of her. She can't do anything to him. Is she going to devour him? Don't worry. Nolan isn't someone that can be forced into doing anything. Quincy was rendered speechless. Meanwhile, in the office, Cecile looked at the papers scattered all over the floor, then at the man sitting on the chair with the back facing her. Nolan wrapped his fingers on the armrest, but didn't turn around. Yes? Cecile smiled, picked up the papers, walked to the desk, and arranged them into a tidy pile. Mr. Goldmann, you shouldn't be angry with your wife even if you disagreed. She is, after all, the woman that you love. Even if there was a misunderstanding, you should try to get to the bottom of things. Nolan's rapping stopped, and he swirled the chair with no expression. This was what you wanted to speak to me about? Cecile looked down and smiled. I know I'm not the best person to say this. No. Nolan crossed his fingers and put them under her chin. You're a good person, and you're right. My wife has been spoiled and asked me to take action against the Hannigan. Do you think I should? Cecile paused before saying. But Mrs. Goldmann has been bullied, and it's normal that she asked you to do that. The Hannigan may not be as huge as Black Gold, but they're one of the biggest players in the hospitality industry. So, if you take action against them, you will lose some advantage. Chapter 1317. Nolan's eyes were hard to read. So, you think that benefits are important, right? Cecile smiled and said, everyone who runs an empire would be interested in benefits. She walked forward and leaned closer. If my husband was a businessman, I would support his choices. A woman who can't even resolve a conflict isn't a good wife. Nolan's expression was hard to read when he looked at her and was quiet. Cecile stuffed a lipstick into his coat pocket and smiled seductively at him. If you trust me, I can be like Mr. Lawson and help you. Nolan laughed. Sure, if you're so confident, I can give you a chance. Cecile stood up straight and smiled. I won't let you down. After she left, Nolan took out the lipstick, threw it into the trash, and then wiped his hand with a napkin. Quincy walked in. Mr. Goldmann, what did she want? She isn't just after Z. Nolan stood up, walked to Quincy, and patted his shoulder. This is going to be a long performance, so we need to find out what she wants as soon as possible. She'll follow you around as your assistant, so keep an eye on her. At Seoul, Maisy paced around her office, and after a short while, Sadai walked in and said something in her ear. She was a little surprised. She requested to work close to Nolan? Sadai nodded. Quincy said that she isn't just after you. Her bigger goal might just be to ruin your marriage. Maisy suddenly smiled. I guess that argument we acted out gave her a chance, but that was great. She crossed her arms, stood in front of the desk, paused, and said, at least we're secretly watching her. If Cecile kept hidden, she would be able to conceal her motives, and they would only be able to react since they don't know what kind of person she was yet and her motives. Now that she had a chance to approach Nolan, it wouldn't be bad for them. Cecile was happy that she was able to come in between her and Nolan. If she believed them, she would have fallen into their trap. This time, Maisy was going to work with Nolan and slowly expose who Cecile was. Cecile working as an assistant became news in Black Gold, and the people who didn't know thought that there had been a crack in Nolan and Maisy's relationship. They were more convinced because Cecile was beautiful. Everyone said that Nolan must have been bewildered for falling for a newly hired employee. However, whenever the staff saw Maisy, they knew that something big was going to happen and were ready to watch the drama unfold. Maisy got into the office and saw how close Cecile was to Nolan when they were speaking, and she snapped. I heard that you have a new assistant. I was wondering who it was, and it turned out to be this woman. Nolan looked at her with no change in expression. Why are you here? Why can't I be here? You've been cold to me ever since our argument. Maisy slammed her bag on the desk, and the pen that was on the files fell to the floor. She ignored it and walked closer. Why? Have you fallen for this woman? Chapter 1318. Nolan loosened his tie and calmly said, "No." Cecile saw that Maisy was upset, so she tried to explain, "Mrs. Vanderbilt, it's a misunderstanding. This is none of your business." Maisy glared at her. Cecile was happy when she saw that. "How could you suspect him? We're just working together, and you're his wife. You should trust him." Maisy stared at her face and chuckled. "What? Are you feeling bad because of this? You knew that I'm his wife, but if I didn't show up just now, you'd probably be in his arms already." Nolan almost smiled, but he kept his composure. "Z, go home." Maisy yelled, "Must you keep this woman around?" Nolan frowned. "This is my office. Don't make a scene here." Cecile was relieved when Nolan said that, so she continued. "Ma'am, this isn't soul. It's black gold. Please understand." Maisy slapped her across the face when she was almost finished. Cecile turned her face over and looked at Maisy in disbelief. "Ma'am." Maisy approached her. "Who do you think you are? All the women who tried to get close to my husband have lost to me, and even you won't be as good as I am." Cecile put her hand to her face and looked like she was wronged. "Ma'am, that's a huge misunderstanding." At that moment, Nolan said, "Maisy, stop it, go home." Maisy looked at him. "You're chasing me away?" She angrily picked up her bag. "All right, don't let me find out that you're doing something behind my back. And you, I won't let you get away with this." She turned and left without looking back. The moment the door closed, Cecile looked toward Nolan, who looked calm, so she didn't say anything but instead took a step back. "Mr. Goldmann, it'd be best if you explained to her." Nolan opened up a file with no expression. "There's no need. I can't spoil her too much." Cecile didn't say anything, but the corners of her lips curled slightly upward. Rowena Summers failed because they were madly in love, but now that they've been married for so many years, their relationship is no longer as hot. Too bad that she wasn't able to live long enough to see this. But Cecile could. In the garage, Maisy sat at the back of the car and touched up on her makeup. "She probably believes us 100% now." Quincy, who was in the passenger's seat, turned to look at her with a huge grin. "Daisy definitely got her acting skills from both of you. The entire company is going to be talking about this tomorrow." "That's perfect." Maisy put her mirror away and looked up. How would it look real if that didn't happen? Cecile, who was in the driver's seat, looked at Quincy. "You can leave now." Quincy didn't know what to say. Was he just a tool that could be summoned and pushed away when needed? When he was getting off, Maisy called out to him, "People would be suspicious if you just went back like that." Quincy paused. "What should I do then?" Maisy smiled and looked at Cecile, who understood her. She suddenly curled her finger, asking Quincy to come closer. Quincy suspiciously leaned in, and then Cecile gave him a big punch on his left eye, which made him yelp in pain. "Why did you have to do that?" Chapter 1319. Maisy leaned closer and couldn't help but laugh when she saw his black eye. "I'm sorry, Quincy, we have to make it look believable." Cecile did pull back. "You're all devils." Quincy angrily got out of the car. After that incident, a lot of people believed that Maisy and Nolan were breaking up, and the rumors even got to Nicholas. When Nolan got home, he was summoned to the study. Nicholas slammed on the desk angrily. "How dare you, you rascal?" Alfred had told Nolan about this, so he knew why his father wanted to speak to him. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Dad, it's not what you think." "What then?" Nicholas knocked on the desk. "Nolan, you begged Z to marry you, but now that you have her, you're not even appreciating her." Nolan was feeling more and more helpless. "I told you, it's not what you think." "What else then, Dash?" Nicholas looked at the things that were on the desk and finally picked up a book to throw at him. Maisy suddenly rushed it. "Dad, hold on." Nicholas was in a throwing position but stopped when he saw Maisy. "Don't try to help this bastard." I'll skin him for betraying you. Maisy held back her laughter and walked in front of Nolan. Dad, listen. It really isn't what you think. We did this, for a reason. A reason? Nicholas calmed down and placed the book back on the table. I would like to know the reason. Maisy explained everything to him. After clearing everything, the anger on Nicholas' face disappeared. He glared at Nolan. Is that true? Nolan smiled sadly. What else? I won't betray the wife I worked so hard to marry. Nicholas was quiet. Maisy walked behind him and gave him a shoulder massage. Please don't be angry, Dad. It's our fault for not telling you about it earlier. I'm relieved if it's not true. Nicholas sighed but remembered something and looked at Nolan. Who is this, Cecile? Nolan frowned. I'm not sure. We don't have a lot of information about her. Nicholas rubbed his temple, because a headache started. However, Nolan slowly added, her actual name is probably Maxine Reynolds. We can know more if we find out who Maxine Reynolds is. Nicholas paused and looked up. Maxine Reynolds? Maisy and Nolan both looked toward him. Do you know her? Nicholas shook his head. No. I don't. But he was deep in thought. Nolan and Maisy looked at each other when Quincy suddenly popped up. Mr. Goldmann, when he saw that Nicholas was there, he nodded. You're here, sir. Nicholas asked, what's the matter? Quincy looked at Nolan, who then nodded, so he continued. People from Staso said they have information about the sisters, Sue and Maxine Reynolds. Meanwhile, in Staso, a group of men in black rushed into a residence while a handsome young man sat in the car parked in the yard. It was none other than Wayne Goldmann, chapter 1320. Even though he was just 13, he was already 5 feet 9 inches tall. He looked exactly like the handsome protagonist of a TV series when he was in his uniform. The men in black searched the residence, and after a long time, one of them rushed to the car with something in hand. When Wayne lowered the window, the man said, Young Mr. Goldmann, we found this box. Wayne took the box and opened it. There was an old bronze pocket watch that could be opened up. There was a picture about the size of an inch inside. A row of men in black stood in the yard of the Goldmann court, and when they saw Wayne walking over, they courteously greeted him, Young Master Goldmann. He walked between them. Where's Grandpa? One of the men replied, in the study. Then he brought him to the study. Wayne walked in, and Titus looked up, who was going through some documents. Wayne, how can I help you? Nolan placed the pocket watch on the desk, which made Titus pause. He picked up the watch carefully. Where did you find this? Quincy asked our men to look into a woman named Maxine Reynolds. She's here and is a threat to my mother. Now that I have the power, I must remove anyone threatening my mom. Titus suddenly fell quiet after hearing his answer, and he looked at the watch. In the evening, at the Goldmann mansion. Nolan lifted her chin. Thinking about Maxine? She nodded and lazily leaned into his arms. Even though we can confirm that Cecile is Maxine, I don't understand why she would change her looks and come over. Nolan put his chin on her head and looked at something in the distance. We have to force her to expose her intentions. Maisy looked up. Force her? He nodded, ran his fingers through her hair, and smiled. I'll be the bait. She seems to be very interested in me. Maisy's smile faded before she suddenly pushed him away and looked away. You just have to say that she likes you.